This was called the Great Society Program. All right. So when we look at what the Great Society was, the Great Society is going to see a great deal of government spending on a number of projects. The first of these is going to be what you and I would refer to as welfare, which is just straight up cash infusions of, hey, you're poor, here's some money, right? Education expansion, government housing, Medicare, and a number of others. Now, conservatives at the time would later, and still today, challenge these programs as big failed wastes of money. One of the questions they ask is, we've spent trillions of dollars on this, and that's why we don't have poor people anymore. And they would say, well, no, poverty's not gone, it hasn't been eliminated, it hasn't even been seriously reduced. And more importantly, it also creates the idea of government dependence. So when somebody proposes and say, hey, we're spending all this money, it's not getting rid of poverty, then any opponent candidate can just say, well, vote for me and I'll keep the money flowing to you. And so this is the goals, and when you compare this to then the criticism of this as well. Now, LBJ's greatest undeniable domestic success is going to come from the civil rights movement. With Kennedy's assassination and a number of other media successes for Dr. King, it's going to really put a great deal of pressure on the Democrats in the Senate that are filibustering the bill to sort of get out of the way of this. And once they did, it turns out that there were enough votes to get it passed. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is going to be one of the great important pieces of legislation in all of American history. And what it does, it bans all forms of segregation in public places, government jobs, housing, and basically everywhere else. So this is going to take place, and then you couple it with the next year's legislation, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, to make sure that voting is as accessible to people regardless of race, etc. These are going to be major triumphs for the Civil Rights Crusade. And so this is Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office on Air Force One, and as a show of, I guess, solidarity, he had the recently bereaved Jackie Kennedy. This is John F. Kennedy's now very new widow standing right next to him, and so if she looks like she's about to cry, it's probably because she is in this regard. And so these are a number of these Great Society programs. Kindergarten comes from this, and Head Start, and a lot of these. Department of Health and Human Services, public housing, food stamps, these are all projects of the Great Society. And then, of course, there is a great deal of criticism of the Great Society. In this one, you've got a very shaky kind of governmental series of boxes, food stamps, rent subsidies, child care, that a lot of people are on, but of course, if any politician were to come along and say, hey, we want to get rid of this, then putting these people on these programs is just setting them up for failure. And then, of course, one of the great parodies of the I Want You for the U.S. Army is I Want Your Money. None of these Great Society programs are free, and they're going to spend trillions of dollars over the past several decades. And you got to get that money from somewhere. So taxes are going to be a major component of this when we consider all of these Great Society programs. This is some of the criticism of this, that when you look at the divorce rate out of wedlock birth rates, 1965 when the Great Society kicks in, that a lot of people have said that the Great Society has disproportionately hurt African Americans, in that you had a fairly high out of wedlock birth rate, and then by the end of the century, you have an insanely high out of wedlock birth rate. Whether that's the actual correlating factor or not, it will remain to be seen. As I mentioned earlier, there isn't one civil rights movement. In a lot of ways, there's kind of two civil rights movements. There's going to be the early one, and then there's going to be the later one, and they're going to change in both of their sort of demeanor and also their geography. Because if you are protesting against Jim Crow, 1964 civil rights movement kills that. You can't walk into a restaurant and then they say, okay, you people of your color, you can't sit here. You can't. Yes, yeah, you can. You can't tell me I can't. I have to sit here on the bus, or any of those segregation measures that had been legal before. But when you look at other types of segregation that happen naturally, those are going to continue to take place, meaning that African Americans are still going to wind up in the neighborhoods that they had been in before. White people are still going to be in the neighborhoods where they had been before. And so as a result of that, the businesses, the schools, all of society is still going to be in that orbit. And this is referred to as de facto segregation, whereas the Jim Crow laws were what was known as de jure, or by law segregation. Well, the law is gone, but there's still a great deal of de facto segregation going on. And the problem with this is there's no law that you've got to change for this. There's no amount of protesting that you've got to do. You've got to change people's minds. And so if you were in the civil rights movement in the South and you wanted to see Jim Crow go away, the 1964 Civil Rights Act makes Jim Crow go away. And so you can count this as a great deal of success. And so as a lot of these people in these northern urban environments, as they get into the late 1960s, they're protesting and say, hey, we have poor neighborhoods, hey, we have bad schools, hey, we have these problems with economic inclusion. Well, there's no way to protest those problems away. And so as a result of that, we're going to see that they're going to get frustrated. And when you get large groups of people together and they get frustrated, that's when we're going to see some violence. And so some examples of this, when we look at Malcolm X, in a lot of ways, he is almost the sort of the mirror image of what we see as Martin Luther King, who is a Christian, southern, kind of rural, fighting against de jure segregation. Malcolm X, northern, urban, Muslim, and he is going to lead black Muslims in the Nation of Islam in a very separatist kind of vein, and he promises violence if necessary. You'll also see Stokely Carmichael. He's going to touch off the Black Power movement. And at these rallies, instead of singing "We Shall Overcome," Carmichael's people began singing "We Shall Overrun." You'll see the Black Panther group. They're going to grow very large in numbers. They would promise violence to protect black interests and protect protesting against the Vietnam War. They felt the draft of the Vietnam War unfairly drafted African Americans at higher proportions than white Americans. And so they sort of started cordoning off areas of these cities and they said, okay, this is ours, and we're the army that protects these areas. Okay. Now, regardless of these various causes, we're going to see over 100 riots break out in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And this is where we're also going to get the term "burn, baby, burn." Right? Now, when we compare this to what was going on in America during the early 1960s, the fight against de jure segregation, again, like I said, a lot of Americans, the civil rights movement is not in their face or in their yard, or on their street. It happens on TV. And so when they see people, they're protesting for freedom, they get bitten by dogs, or they get arrested, or they get, fire hoses turned on, and they go, man, I feel sorry for these people. But when they see images of large crowds of African Americans sort of rioting in the streets and smashing windows, and they say, these aren't people that I really want to support. And so a lot of them are going to drop their support for advancing civil rights because it's going to turn violent and it's going to turn ugly. Even if there's perhaps a good reason for this, police brutality or unfair conditions or something like that, all they see is a riot on TV. So this is Malcolm X, what he would look like. This is Stokely Carmichael. He's at a Black Power rally here with the Students for a Democratic Society. A couple of shots of the Black Panther. They have some wicked cool uniforms. They got the black beret, black jacket. Even this guy's got black sunglasses, right? Of course, all black shotguns, right? This is the Watts race riot. This one doesn't take place in 1968, but this is going to be the biggest of all the race riots that take place in the 1960s, and this one's in 1965. But this is what you would have seen all across America in the summer of 1968: is riots, just everywhere as a result of that. Well, as I've kind of hinted at, the Vietnam War plays a big role in the background of a lot of this social unrest, and we'll see why when we talk about this. Now, for those of you who don't know where Vietnam is, okay, you just go hit China and then head south. And the problem with this is a similar situation to what we saw in Korea, where the northern half of Vietnam is taken over by communist forces and the southern half is being administered by forces that support democracy, first France and then the United States. And as we mentioned before, the Eisenhower administration was the one that put forward that idea of the domino theory, that if one country, i.e. South Vietnam, falls to communism, then they're all going to fall to communism until eventually the United States is going to be surrounded by communist nations. And so this problem with this, dealing with communism invading South Vietnam, was that the leader of the Vietnamese communists was a guy named Ho Chi Minh. And had there been an election anywhere in Vietnam at this point, and asked, okay, who's the most popular guy that we think should be president, everybody, even the people that like democracy, would have said, well, it's Ho Chi Minh. He's the George Washington of Vietnam. But the problem for the United States was he's a communist. If only he wasn't a communist, we could probably get behind this guy. And so the U.S. policy of containment demanded that the United States help defend South Vietnam. Well, we're going to have an incident. North Vietnamese ships are supposedly going to fire on the USS Maddox, and there's still a lot of debate today over whether they fired on them or they didn't fire on them. Some say yes, they did, no, they didn't. It didn't matter because Johnson says, okay, we've got people that are shooting at the American flag. He goes to Congress and he says, hey, you guys need to give me some war powers to be able to fight this war here in Vietnam. And they're going to do it. They're going to give them basically an open-ended order, a blank check, and say, okay, you go to town on North Vietnam. And so what he does is he changes the U.S. military posture in Vietnam. The United States had sent in a number of these advisors, all right? And you would think an advisor is, well, this is how you work an M16, or this is, what you're going to do. But a lot of these advisors are special forces guys, and they're doing their thing, all right? They're military people doing military stuff. Instead, Johnson decides to fight the Vietnam War basically like World War II. We're going to send in thousands of U.S. ground troops and air troops, and we're going to send, our boats up their rivers, and we're going to fight these guys in a big kind of, instead of a small special forces kind of war, this is going to be a big military kind of fight, right? Well, it turns out that the fighting is very devastating for everybody involved. And the major part of the problem the United States has is not in actually fighting the enemy, but figuring out who the enemy is. Because everybody that is there, whether they're in favor of the United States or whether they're against this, they all are Vietnamese. They all look the same. They all speak the same language. And these Viet Cong infiltrators don't wear uniforms. And so they'll hide amongst the civilian population. They'll attack U.S. forces from some village in the middle of the night. They'll tell the villagers not to turn them into the Americans, otherwise they'll slit their throats in the middle of the night. And so the Americans come back through the next morning. Okay, where are the Viet Cong? We know they're here. I don't know. Well, we don't know where they are. And so they can't tell who these guys are. And of course, they also have terrain on their side, right? That the dense mountainous jungles of Vietnam are easy to hide in. And so when you're facing an enemy like the United States that has all this air power, and you really don't, well, how do you fight these guys off? Well, you just get to where they can't see you. If they can't see you, they can't bomb you. And so that's what these guys are going to do, right? And so the United States soldiers are forced to go in, and they've got to fight civilians as well as the Viet Cong, and it's going to turn into what the media dubbed a quagmire, right? And it's sort of being stuck in quicksand. The United States is fighting for a very ill-defined political goal, with evaporating support for the war at home. And when you're looking at a situation like World War II, it's pretty easy to tell if you're winning or not. Right? The closer you get to Berlin, the more you're winning. But this isn't. You're not trying to take over North Vietnam. You're just trying to prevent them from taking over South Vietnam. How do you know if you're winning? Well, you kill a lot of them, and this is sort of how it turned into. Well, we killed a lot of them, and it becomes kind of a body count war. But how do you know when they're going to give up? Are they ever going to give up? And so this sort of drags on, and really the tipping point for a lot of people politically was the 1968 Tet Offensive. Tet was the name of one of these North Vietnamese generals who says, okay, we're going to stop doing this hiding, amongst the civilian population. We're going to stop this clandestine kind of stuff. We think we've really punished the Americans, and we're going to catch them off guard. We're going to come out from hiding. We're going to attack the Americans everywhere that they are. And so this is going to open up fighting basically all throughout South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese communist forces are going to come out, they're going to get on the roads, they're going to bring out their tanks, they're going to bring out their airplanes, they're going to bring out their infantry in the cities, and they're going to go after the United States. Now, initially, this surprise factor catches the Americans off guard. Whoa, we didn't know these guys were going to do this, all right? But militarily, the United States bounces back and says, okay, this is exactly what we want. The number one problem that we had with fighting these guys was not that they were too strong for us, it was the fact that we didn't know where they were. Now we know where they are. And so the United States whipped the crap out of these people. They blew up their tanks, they shot down their planes, they rounded up most of their infantry. General Tet and General Giap, who was, they were putting this together, supposedly they just flew off the handle. Oh, the United States has destroyed our army, we're going to lose the war. What they didn't know, at least not initially, was that a lot of people in the American homeland now at this point come to the conclusion that this isn't what armies that are about to be defeated act like. President Johnson is telling us we're about to win the war, we just got to push them a little farther and they will topple. Instead they catch us off guard and they launch this massive offensive. And so what you're going to see is the protests against the war movement is going to go up and the support for the war is going to go way down. So this is Vietnam, right? This is this tiny little sliver of a country on the east coast of the Indochina Peninsula. And then so there's China, and then this is where this is, and of course, this is the way that it is now, because it's all communist Vietnam. And this is what you have to go through if you're fighting here in the Vietnam War. You're up here to your knees in these rice paddies, you're fighting your way, have to be brought in by helicopter, some of these remote jungle locations, where are the Vietnamese here? You're fighting these urban areas, and of course, you got to start taking up prisoners, and there's all guys, they're shooting at us, well, some of them are, some of them aren't. You got to look through this and say, okay, which one of these guys are the Vietnamese that are supporting the Americans, and which one of them are Viet Cong? Well, they all look the same, they all speak the same, and so the United States is going to round up a lot of people and attack a lot of people that it doesn't mean to, that it doesn't really need to. And these guys were pretty sly about how to hide their locations. They would hide under a village in some cases, these holes in the ground. You could come in via the water, and if you dig it deep enough, then even the American bombers couldn't hurt you. This is a village that gets napalmed in the Vietnam War because the Americans are taking fire from it, and of course the kids who have nothing to do with what's going on with this are going to get hit with napalm. as a result of that. This is another one of these images here. This is a North Vietnamese Viet Cong sort of infiltrator who gets caught by the South Vietnamese army, ostensibly the United States' ally, and he just gets executed. He gets shot on national TV, and blood spurts out. It's pretty gross as a result of that. So there's going to be a great deal of protest against the Vietnam War. Now, interestingly enough, it's going to start out pretty slow. There's not going to be a lot of protest against this, but it's going to pick up steam as the decade goes on, and it's actually going to get worse even after Johnson is out of office, when a lot of the stuff that Johnson had done is going to be revealed to the American public. Well, by this point, that baby boom generation that we had talked about before, this sort of big sort of swelling of people born in the late 1940s and on through the 1950s, now are reaching college age. And as a result of that, they are taking their sort of civic responsibility to get involved with a number of political movements. The Civil Rights Movement, the one that we've already talked about, but also in terms of protesting the Vietnam War, and we'll see alternate lifestyles. These people sort of get the catch-all nickname the hippies. They're trying to act hip, right? And that's where the nickname comes from. They alternate protesting the Vietnam War with rock concerts. The most famous of these is Woodstock here in 1969. And so the college campi across America, they become sort of flashpoints between the authorities and students who are protesting either the Vietnam War or women's rights or civil rights or whatever. And so in some cases, they're going to end up being kind of violent. And so what you're going to see is when this violence would break out, a lot of mainstream Americans, people who were kind of out of college, many of them kind of turned against the protesters, right? But a lot of even these war-weary Americans, they really began to question the war's legitimacy, whether or not the Johnson administration was telling the truth, because it becomes increasingly apparent to a lot of people that he really wasn't letting everything out about the Vietnam War, because he was constantly saying, oh, we're winning the war, just a little bit more, and these guys will snap. And it turns out that, no, it doesn't look like it really is going to work out. So here you can see one of the big sort of protest movements, and it looks basically, the same as any other Vietnam protest movement of any war. So these hippies, and so, you get to walk around naked and roll around in the mud and do all kinds of mind-altering chemicals, paint a bus that you got psychedelic colors and go to some rock concert or a war protest or, whatever's going on at this point. So National Guard called out to try to defend against these protesters, and so what do? You try to make them look like a bunch of thugs, and so you put a bullet, a flower in place of a bullet down the barrel of a gun. Just FYI, flowers will not stop bullets. So if you're going to protest, just be careful with this kind of thing. So it turns out that the Vietnam disaster is going to cause two major casualties. One is going to be LBJ's Great Society program, because ever increasingly members of Congress would come to President Johnson and say, look, we've only got so much money. We can either spend it on the war, or we can spend it on giving it away to people like you want to. The other consequence is going to be Johnson's presidency itself. All right? He is unable to really remove the Vietnam albatross from his neck, and when he's up for re-election in 1968, Johnson doesn't even decide to try. He says, okay, forget it. I'm not going to do this. And so in 1968, he says, I'm gone. Right? Now, what you're going to see is Nixon, who's been kind of dumped onto the ash heap of history as a result of his defeat here in 1960. He comes back here in 1968, and he is going to capture the Republican nomination, and he has basically all the benefits of this, because he can go in and for the pro-war, for the anti-war crowd, he can say, all right, we're going to get out of Vietnam, right? So he's going to get those votes. And then for all the people that, well, I don't really want to surrender, so don't worry, we'll beat them first, and then we'll get out. And so he's really able to repudiate everything of the Johnson administration, and Hubert Humphrey is left with the fact that he can't really support the war, because a huge number of these Democrats are ever increasingly coming out against the war, and he can't really say, well, I'm against it, because, well, the Democrats, you guys started this under Johnson. And so he's kind of stuck with the same problems that Johnson had. And of course, you've got a number of riots all breaking out here in the summer of 1968, and Nixon says we need to run on law and order. And so he's going to be able to repudiate basically all of this stuff here in one fell swoop. And so this is one of the great images of Johnson, of his presidency, just sort of crushed by bad news from the Vietnam War. And this is a political cartoon. One of the things that Johnson, he had this sort of hyper-male personality that he constantly had to prove that he was kind of the toughest guy ever. He apparently had a scar from some operation or something that had happened to him, and he'd like to show people this, right? And he's like, oh, look at my scar, look how tough I am. And so the artist, what he's done is he's made the scar in the shape of Vietnam, that this is Johnson's scar as a result of that. So as you can see here, Nixon is going to pull off a little bit less than 1% victory over Hubert Humphrey in 1968, but in terms of electoral college, his broad support everywhere, he's going to fumble pretty bad as a result of that. So there's Richard Nixon, right? He's going to win here in 1968, and so when we get together next time, we'll talk about, well, what does Richard Nixon and then succeeding administrations do rising this sort of tide of conservatism.